Next, we have Professor Ila Fiete. She's a professor from Brain and Cognitive Sciences, also an associate investigator at the McGovern Institute. Her research focuses on describing how development shaped neural networks to perform computation and how the brain represents and manipulates information.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Nice to see so many of you here. Thanks for coming. So I will be telling you just, a small vignette of some of the things that we're doing. So my lab's interests are pretty diverse. We really focus very much on the sort of neuroscience, neural circuit side of things. We ask how the brain solves problems. We build models of neural circuits that are constrained by known anatomy in the brain, by the behavior of animals, and we try to understand some principles about how the circuits are organized and why they're organized that way. Okay, so a quick question is why do I care about these natural biological agents and their neural circuits? And there's sort of two reasons. One is a human perspective. There are many different ways to obtain intelligent solutions. As we're seeing more and more, we're very aware that it's possible to build some really impressive artificial intelligences, and at the same time, human intelligence is a very unique spot in this landscape of possible solutions to hard problems. So it's just from a selfish perspective, also from a medical perspective, there's many reasons to be interested in natural brains. And then from an efficiency perspective, so even if you care about just building artificial intelligence, the brain might teach us about efficiencies. Evolution has optimized for the natural world and for learnability and evolvability. So I'll just tell you about one project that kind of connects with some of the stuff that Catherine was telling you about. So this is about construction of models of the world by fragmenting the world. So you take continuous experience that we live in the world and then break it up into pieces. And the question is, why the brain does this. I want to just tell you like a little bit about what the brain does, and then why it might be useful in thinking about even machine learning and artificial intelligence. So okay, so here's an observation. So there are these cells in the entorhinal cortex, a cortical area in the mammalian brain, and these cells fire in these really beautiful irregular lattice-like patterns as a function of space. Now, these are forming basically a form of Euclidean representation of the space. So, you move a fixed distance, and then, these cells, after you move a fixed distance, fire. So they sort of map out like a nice grid of the world. So it's amazing that these nice periodic responses exist in the brain. And this is what you see when animals are running around in a simple featureless square room. So it's just like a room that has no features, and it's just a flat environment. And so, you can think about this as just internally in the mental state. This is just like some map that the animal constructs in its brain, a simple Euclidean map of a simple Euclidean space. But now when you put the animals into, and so these are rats that are running around. If you put them into a hairpin maze over here like this, and then you watch them run around, and then you look at the responses of these cells, the same grid cells that have these nice periodic responses, now seem to have these responses where sort of they're doing different things in the even arms and different things in the odd arms. So it really looks like what they're doing is that they're breaking up this space into one representation for one set of arms, and then they jump maps and build a separate map for the other space. So we can think about them building a Euclidean map here and then two separate Euclidean maps over here. Now if you put them in this 3-room environment over here, 2 rooms and a hallway, then what you can see here is that the cells are responding by having this nice triangular lattice pattern in one room, but then in the second room, they have exactly the same lattice pattern. So you can see that here they have, you can see that you can see it's an exact replication of this. So instead of it being one globally Euclidean continuous map of this whole space, it's actually 2 separate pieces that are identical for the 2 rooms, and then one hallway piece. Okay, and then these 2 rooms are pretty visually similar, and so that would be one of the reasons why it seems to be picking the same representation for these 2 rooms. So we see that there are these sort of locally Euclidean representations, but then in these more complex environments, the representations are more globally sort of non-Euclidean. And so the question is, how do we model these dynamics? And I'm sorry, the slide seems to have some strange thing going on with it. So we're interested in questions like, can we build neural models that predict where these sort of fragmentations are going to happen, and then can we also use these fragmentations to solve tasks in for example, machine learning. So I don't have time to get into the details, but basically we can build a multi-system neural model which has a short-term memory system that takes past observations, recent past observations, and based on the recent past observations makes a prediction about what the next observation is going to be. And then if there's a big discrepancy between the prediction and the actual observation, then that corresponds to a state of high surprisal. And then there should be a decision to just break the current map and form a new map. And then there's a long-term memory system where, given the decision to form a new map, the question is, which new map should you form? Should you retrieve an existing map that matches the current observation, or should you start a whole new map altogether, right? And so the system, the long-term memory, matches the current observation with past observations to decide if there's a reasonably similar map that should be pulled up, or with some small probability pulls up a brand new map. So what happens when we do this? So when we build models that have these short-term and long-term memories, models of this like entorhinal cortical system as well, then we find that we can reproduce a lot of the neural findings. We can get these fragmentations of the map. So here, basically, if the agent is traversing, this should be a video. I don't know why it's not playing. So if the agent's moving through this hairpin maze, then it's sort of like it's in the neural state space. It's sort of on one piece of the internal map, and then at these red dots, it jumps to another piece of map and another piece of map and so on. So it's sort of alternating between maps. Now we see there are 4 major maps because it turns out that it has one map going from left to right in every other arm, and a second map in the, say the even arms, and then going from right to left, it has another pair of maps. And this actually comports with some of the neuroscience, and so this is an example of the kinds of predictions that this model can make. So the other thing that's interesting here is that these are agents that are moving through the environment in this model without any prior experience in that environment, and they're making these decisions to fragment the map in the very first run through the environment. So here is like this online prediction of this agent. The red dots, the red areas show where the remappings happen, and you can run this in different environments, including some complicated shaped environments. Now, you can think about this as sort of a clustering of space. And so we can also compare the response with like offline normative clustering algorithms where you build a matrix that is transitions between different points in space, cluster that matrix, and then we get a similar clustering with these normative algorithms. So the idea is that here these biological agents are producing basically online clustering of space, right? They're chunking space, like even though it's continuously traversed space, they're building these like abstractions, which are like chunks of space as their units of representation. And so this model produces segmentations across different environments that match where the fragmentations happen in these neural maps that are observed in experiments. And so that gives us some sense that maybe on some level the model is capturing some of the key elements of fragmentation. How much time do I have? I guess a couple more minutes. Okay, great. So now you might say, well, what is the functional advantage of these kinds of fragmentations? So there are many different advantages. Okay, so first from just the spatial mapping perspective, a common problem in space, so there's a field in robotics, spatial localization and mapping, where agents enter into a new environment, and then robots, for example, and they need to map the space. But one of the problems is, so mapping means assigning abstract coordinates to the objects that are seen in that environment, right? So you want to just sort of lay all the observations into a nice coordinate frame. The problem is that sensors are noisy, and so it's tough to know your coordinates as you move through the world because you accumulate errors. So PI errors called path integration errors. So you're just moving through, have noisy velocity estimates, and so you start to build these maps and anchor them to like faulty coordinates, and so it's not a faithful map. So one advantage of fragmentation is that if you have to map out a large space, then rather than making a long trajectory through the whole space where you accumulate a lot of error, instead if you just explore more locally and densely and build a local map, then there's less accumulation of error. You build that local map, it's accurate, and now you truncate and build a new map and so on. And all you have to do then is just remember which map connects to which map. So you kind of get like these chunk-like abstractions that represent different patches of the space, and then they're all connected more topologically. Also, it gives rise to like this sort of more, as I already said, this chunking, this abstraction, and abstractions allow you to build hierarchies, and then you can do things like reinforcement learning problems where you can set intermediate goals and say, if I have to search through a space, or if I need to plan a trajectory through a space, or I need to find, my path somewhere, then, planning on the level of these chunks is easier than planning on the position by position level. And also more generally, having these sort of abstractions allows a system that is fundamentally, doing sort of this Euclidean representation, like these grid cells are doing, and then transfer that, the sort of Euclidean representations into a more general system that lets you also represent non-Euclidean structures. So, for example, here is an example, a tree is an example of a very non-Euclidean structure, right? And if you were to take this tree and embed it into a Euclidean space, right, then you would get a collision where, if you started from the parent node and went left and then right, you would end, versus if you went right and then left, these are distinct on the tree, but in a Euclidean embedding, there would be a collision, right? So that's not a great solution. So instead, but there is still meaning. Maybe locally at each node, there might be meaning in a Euclidean sense, because there's sort of like a sense in which you want to go up left and up right versus down left and down right. That might refer to, mother, father, and then son, daughter, right? Like, so there might be some sort of real meaning in sort of the directions going up, down, left, right, and so on. So you might want to use something that's both locally Euclidean and more globally non-Euclidean. And so the idea here is that these fragmentations basically allow you to, have, as you continuously traverse a local part of the environment, you have a Euclidean representation, but then you have this fragmentation or remapping event, which then allows you to represent these non-Euclidean objects. So I'm out of time, and so I just want to mention a couple of things. Just a quick shout out that to work from Jaedong, who Catherine also mentioned over here. Jaedong has been working on extending these fragmented sort of models of the world into the non-spatial domain. So just like we think about spatial fragmentation of models, you can also think about sort of building piecewise models of any sort of domain where you're trying to learn the domain. It could be, robotic arm control, or it could be, video game, for example, a reinforcement agent learning video games. And here again, the idea is very similar. It's like you build a model and you make predictions as you go. And if your model is bad, your predictions fail, you should stop that model, start a new one, and then use that one. And so Jaedong applies this to reinforcement learning tasks, where he finds that the sort of fragmentation approach results in better performance in games like Frostbite and James Bond, which have more heterogeneous sort of state spaces, and it prevents some of the problems that are seen in more standard RL settings. So I'll just stop there, but let me just end over here and just say that some of this work was done by the following people in my lab. So yeah, please ask questions during the time outside later. Thanks.